So, in the remaining time, we want to open the floor for discussion of all of these issues. And just to make sure that we all remember what everybody said, I'll just go over really just the points which everybody talked about. So Amnon talked about interdisciplinarity, about globalization, and about the social role of legal education. Isi talked about teaching in large classes and challenges that brings, experiential learning, the different kinds of experiential learning, and teaching law in a plural and divided society and the great challenges that this brings with. Ilan talked about diversity. Are we diverse or are we homogeneous? And talked about quality teaching, just about giving high quality and excellent teaching services. Oren Perez talked about the legal clinics and law and technology, the different ways in which they can be combined and how to bring that to the forefront of our teaching. And Oren Gazal touched upon the different issues, but focused mainly also about technology and how technology can aid us or hinder learning in law schools. Anybody can comment on any of the above, all of the above. If you just, I don't know, raise your hand, and we'll see how we take it from there.
I had a quick question about, you mentioned these workshops. I didn't quite understand. Could you explain more? But you said they didn't work as well.
No, I didn't say it didn't work. I'm saying that we're thinking whether to expand it or not. So we have a workshop with the prosecution. We have a similar one, that one with defense attorney. We have also one with a private law firm. The idea is that about half of the course is frontal classes, teaching more practical aspects of the law that they've already learned. So, for example, in this prosecution service, it's always after they already learned criminal procedure. But now prosecutors or police investigators or judges come and teach it from a more practical angle. And then the second half, they go to the units, so to the prosecution units, and are asked to take real cases and write the drafts of papers to the court. So indictment or whatever it is, request for remand and non-bail decision and so on. And this is also the way they are examined. So in this specific workshop, the examination is take this case, these are the evidence, now write an indictment according to. So it's much more practically oriented after they studied the theory and the law in the regular classes.
Striking, at least to an American law school dean, how little money was mentioned. Now, you said there was some pressure to have bigger classes, but there was no sort of concern that I heard about sort of the funding model and can law schools survive at their current funding levels, and how it works with the government and how it works with private tuition and how much you subsidize students to come here, if at all. So I'm curious about how that. Maybe it's different between public and private. So it certainly is in the United States different between public and private.
Public universities are heavily subsidized in terms of tuition.
Say it again?
Public universities are heavily subsidized in terms of tuition.
From the state?
From the state, right. So the cost is, I wouldn't say it's close to negligible, and we have scholarships, so it's usually tuition is not the main.
Yeah, but how we finance ourselves?
Does it change year to year with Knesset to Knesset, or can you say now what your funding will be 5 years from now?
More or less, with some deviations. It's not that anything is promised. We don't have an entitlement like Social Security, right? But there is, it's within a boundary of. We have some kind of
so there is
reasonable expectation.
There is the Council for Higher Education, which has a committee, a financial committee, which is not a committee, it's actually a separate institution that should be a buffer zone between the politicians and the higher institution, the higher education institution.
What's it called?
The committee, what's the name of
Commission of Higher Education.
No, not the committee for higher, the other one.
Planning
and budgeting committee. Yeah, planning and budgeting committee. And this planning and budgeting committee decides on a formula how to subsidize the institutions. The formula is based partly on research, partly on teaching. So you get some kind of a money per student, per topic. Law, for example, is subsidized less than all the other topics. Like if it's engineering, then you get more money per student. It also depends.
A year ago,
they changed it a year ago, right?
Per student.
But the thing is, for example, they cut the subsidies by half last year, but we in the law school didn't directly felt it because we have the buffer of the university. So the university get all the money based on all the calculations that the government do about research and teaching formulas, and then give the money to the units. So it doesn't mean that whenever the government, cut the money for law schools and increase the money for engineering, immediately, I suppose at a long time it will happen, but immediately we see a cut in the budget. So there are many, many buffers between the. Of course, there is also the tuition, but
right.
And there's always the university telling us you have to accept more students, as EC said, because this is how the university gets their money. And we try to accept the best students, so we try in a negotiation with the university. Right. They always have the check, so they can tell us if you don't accept as many students as we tell you, we will give you less money. But it's a matter of negotiation. It's not a free market thing.
Go ahead, sorry.
But I think there has been a change in the way deans and Israeli law schools operate. I think 15 years ago, they didn't, I think, were not engaged in fundraising at all. And gradually now it is considered part of their job. It's not like in the US, certainly,
right. Sure.
Certainly not. It's not the kind of the, you will tell me, but it's not seen as the major responsibility, but it is something that is expected more and more.
Both public and private, meaning you both raise public money, you both raise private money. Would it be unusual for you to go to the Knesset and argue for more money? That would be
that would not happen because we have this committee. So it's not the Knesset. It's this.
It's a local civil service.
It's a governmental committee that is comprised of academics and members of the government, headed by a former professor of the law school, former dean of Bar Ilan Law School. Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that we will get more money.
You agree with that?
It's a bureaucratic committee that gets the money from the government, and the government can cut the budget for this committee and split it to the universities.
Right.
So the university will never go to the Knesset, will always go.
But you don't compete for students over money. If a student is deciding between Hebrew University and Haifa, you don't say, I'll give you a scholarship of 5,000, and you say, I'll give you a scholarship of 10,000.
If I have money for scholarships, and I do because of fundraising,
so soft money usually,
then I'll try to attract the best students, of course. So I will offer scholarship for the best potential.
And you'll compete with the people in this room.
In that regard, yes, we will compete. I'll tell them if you come to Haifa and not to Hebrew U, I'll give you this scholarship as long as I have the money. And now I have some money, but it changes, depends on fundraising.
And there is more private fundraising.
Well, at least at Bar Ilan, fundraising is complex because Bar Ilan is very centralized. So we have a kind of a central unit for fundraising, but there is ways in which both you can work on your own, but also even if you collaborate with them, still there is some pressure on you to do several things, and at least at Bar Ilan, I don't know exactly how it is in other faculties here. There is an expectation that the dean will invest significant time in thinking about these issues. It's not that we can wait for the Vata for the money.
I don't want to take up too much time because I get a whole bunch of time afterwards. But on this point, I don't know if David wants to speak to this. You'll hear me say this afternoon, I've taught in 26 countries. And so what's going on here is going global already. That is, your question, Dan, about fundraising. And as everyone here knows, the major universities are looking for funding not only in their own countries, but in other countries. So there's globalization of fundraising. And so as we talk about which kinds of programs are doing interesting things and doing better things. There are people out there raising money for particular issues all over the world. And I've taught students in Singapore that came from India and, believe it or not, Europe. Singapore is unbelievably subsidizing legal education. I teach there every other year or every third year, and the students are from all over the world, and they are heavily subsidized by not only their own countries, but, and this is true where I teach in Central America, in a intense LLM program, they're getting subsidized by their law firms. And so as a, you know, I don't even know where to stop because I have so many things to say, but in the program that I've taught in Latin America, it's called INCAI, and it's a multinational program originally founded by Harvard, and now Georgetown's taken it over. These are executive programs, both in business and in law. The students have a first degree. They're funded by whoever's employing them, banks, law firms. And then this is amazing for an academic teacher. The students who have funding then have to write up, after every module unit course, what concretely they learned in this program that's going to help them. So these funders want immediate payback and understanding. I actually thought, you know, I, whom usually quite critical of capitalist intervention in academic studies, thought I'll learn anything from anybody, and I thought it was a brilliant technique for, you know, as the British phrase would be, value for money, for the funders to get some sense that they're getting something back. And it does focus the students in a way that they, when they're otherwise shopping and doing other things on their laptops, it focuses them because they actually have to write something very concrete after each course module, in my case after every weekend, what it is they've learned and how they're going to apply it. So fundraising, I think, is a global issue, but as you compete for students, I just want to say I think the competition over fundraising is globalized now also, because as many American universities have students abroad, our rich American universities, the Wharton School, where my husband and our unfortunate president are alums, the Wharton School has been raising money in Europe for 30 or 40 years. Very successfully, by giving people little certificates, building brand loyalty, to use all their words, and they raise a lot of money that way. And my University of California, which is a public institution, is doing the same thing. So as you look for, you know, I think we should talk about how students get funded in each system, but recognize that the fundraising itself has been globalized. And I think it feeds into what we wind up talking about what's working, what's interesting in legal education. Because some of this is going to be fund-driven. The ideas that sell will get a lot of money, and then they'll get a lot of support, and some of that's good and some of that's terrible. End of that particular speech.
One more thing, the salaries for professors are heavily regulated, so they're very similar in all the institutions. You cannot compete with
who regulates?
That's
the government. So if they give subsidy, that's part of what they do. The subsidy assures that this tuition is similar in all the public institutions, and that the pay for the professors is very similar.
Is that true in your institutions?
So our model is vastly different, because in Israel you either public or private. We don't get a single cent from the government. We would, had we gotten a single cent, we would have lost our independence, so to speak. Our tuition is $11,000 a year, which is the highest in Israel. It's a joke in American terms. It's not a joke in Israeli terms. We provide socioeconomic based scholarships to about 20% of our student body. It does allow, we have, you know, one nice program that we have, which is more like a sort of a political agenda, is a program from African asylum seekers, but is a small program in all honesty. I should say again, you know, the socioeconomic profile of our students is above average, some would say well above average, because again, you know, tuition is tuition. Luckily, we do not have the culture of student loans in Israel. Fortunately, because we do not have the scenario where you have a 25-year-old boy or girl going bankrupt right after law school, right? So you just have to make do. Parents help out. This is part of the Israeli culture. So, you know, for our students, in many cases, parents help out. Some would stay, even though they're well beyond their military service. Some would actually go back home to fund their studies. So this is the way that it works, and it basically covers our ongoing expenditures. So the way that it works for the law school is that students actually pay for the ongoing expenditures, Any capital project requires funding, external funding. So if you want to establish a new chair, if you want to establish a research institute, any premium that we want to offer above the basic, especially research-oriented, requires fundraising. So I guess that I'm a little bit more occupied with fundraising than my colleagues at the public universities. But again, this is nothing like the American term. So when I spoke about the LLM programs, I should say that I'm amazed by the new equilibrium of prices of LLM programs in the United States, and I practically think it's unfeasible. I know that you get a lot of, Chinese students. I've heard about students from Saudi Arabia, but I think that you're losing many Israelis.
Oh, yeah.
You're losing many people from Europe that you would otherwise cherish, and I understand, your economic side of the matter. But charging $50,000 or $60,000 per year as tuition is truly not feasible for even the above-average Israeli students. It has changed dramatically since my days at Yale Law School or Stanford. This is definitely a burden when you think about, and you have to remember that our law degree is an undergraduate degree. If you actually want to enter the academic job market in Israel, you must have a PhD or SJD, which is the equivalent of an SJD. And this is a point that Karin was talking about, representation of different sections of the population. One of the major obstacles actually comes from the United States, because the ability of many gifted students to pursue an LLM and an SJD in the United States in order to have a good position to start with in the job market in Israel is actually diminishing by the year.
Okay, so we've had some hands, Anita, and then Paul, right? David.
On this question of money, I want to say a little bit about how we approach this at University of Pennsylvania. Our university it's a private university. It has what is called a responsibility-centered management philosophy. Every one of our 12 schools must exist independently and support itself. So our law school raises money through charging tuition, through getting grants from government and foundations, from donations from alumni and other friends. We pay a tax to the university to allow us to be on their campus. They also, though, pay us back most of that in subvention to make it possible for the law school to do. So it's mostly the law school figuring out how to raise its own money. We do use our LLM program and our SJD programs as revenue sources. So yes, only the richest children from Israel and Europe and China can come to get their LLMs or their SJDs. We have over 100 LLM students.
How much is the tuition for
It's about $70,000.
Whoa.
Wow.
Which is also about the price of our JD program as well. So kids are taking out loans to attend law school, the ones who don't come from wealthy families. It is a tragedy for some individual people to take out those loans, but as someone who took out loans in order to attend Harvard Law School, it was well worth it. I feel it paid off, even as someone who went into academia. But you're right, it's outrageous. If you look at the income of people around the world, it's outrageous that to get a high quality legal education, attend one of the top 10 law schools, you have to pay $70,000 a year for 3 years, or 1 year for the LLM. Faculty are paid, though, based on the starting salary is based on roughly what you'd have to pay someone if you were to hire them in a top law firm in New York. So if that number is $200,000, then that's what you could expect to get paid as an entry-level professor. Like
first-year associate?
First-year associate, yeah. So I think that the number now is between $150,000 and $200,000, and most top 10 law schools in the U.S. are paying about $150,000, $200,000 at least to hire to a new professor. So it's very good compensation for faculty, and salaries then range from about that to upwards of about $400,000 to $450,000 for faculty. So it's a very wealthy, a very elite feeling environment in which we operate. It's not affordable for everyone. It's not accessible to everyone because only students with the top test scores and faculty with the top academic credentials can hope to work and attend there. That said, I think that the values of the school are are somewhat in conflict with this elitism that's come from the economic model, because there's a great deal of interest in public interest law, in justice for the poor, and legal clinics. We have a big clinical program that supports immigrants, poor people in a variety of different ways. We have it's kind of a little bit of tension there. Then briefly, multidisciplinary. It's a big deal at my school, and the way it plays out is in terms of having most of our faculty in law have both their law degree and some other credentials, such as a PhD or a master's degree in some other subject matter. Our students are encouraged to get a certificate out in the social sciences or in some other field of study while they're law students. Some students get MBAs, some students get PhDs, and that's very well emphasized. The only kind of university professor we have at Penn are Penn integrates knowledge professors who must be appointed in the law school and one other school, whether it's medicine or arts and sciences or business or whatever. And then we have a lot of emphasis on internationalism in our student body, despite the cost. So we have the LLM program. We have our students going abroad for global research seminars. We have our students going abroad for externships. We have many international visitors coming as visiting scholars, etc. So I guess in brief, tying together the money and the internationalism, globalism theme, I mean, they're fighting each other, right? Because on the one hand, we want to be a global university and a global law school, but we also use the rest of the world as a source of revenue, and we also impose upon our own students the obligation to be willing to make a huge financial sacrifice in order to obtain the education we have to offer.
So David?
Yeah, thanks to the speakers. Very, very interesting panorama, but you don't normally have the opportunity to get at where the different law schools are at. So I've got a question and then a comment. The question really is, legal education for what? And are there not too many lawyers in Israel? Where are the niches? Where are the gaps? And how, given the crisis that happens in the United States over this, it explains lots of other knock-on effects in law faculties in America, how far can those who run, people like you, run law faculties in Israel look forward to the danger of there being saturation, or is it impossible to saturate? I mean, when I was in Israel 40 years ago, there was a saying, if you spit from a roof, it lands either on a cat or on a lawyer. That was 40 years ago, and since then, the cats have grown in number. So the question is, hear all about legal education, but not about... Second point is about globalization, the global and the local, which is the other part of what the title of this conference is about. So, sure, I can talk about King's and its Transnational Law Institute and what it does and so on, particularly in trying to create global lawyers. And my question is, for Oren talking about Haifa, we're here in Haifa at the moment, particularly other law faculties, slightly different. You had an external review. I've read that external review. You have outsiders, and they come and they tell you, you shouldn't be trying to compete in this way, you should be concentrating on the local. I would regard that almost as an insult, frankly. Are they saying that you can't compete with the big boys, with Tel Aviv, with Hebrew? Not exactly.
No.
They're saying focus on what you got, focus on your strengths, focus on what you can do particularly well. But I would like to know more about the implications. I'll be more positive than I intend, but of your suggesting that you can see merit in devoting more of the energy in Haifa to what is more living practical. Because the implications of that could be, as between local and global, how can you make that you're involved in doing then have resonance at the global level? There's the danger that will be seen wrongly, in my view, because there's no such thing as global. Global is just a series of local things, but it will be seen as focusing on the local rather than competing or working on the global. So in other words, should those who have the larger view say, well, some law faculties in Israel are better equipped to produce the global lawyers, are the ones who work on the international stage, and Haifa is not one of them. Should all the law faculties try and do that, even though that's probably unrealistic? That's one question that seems to me not solved by that external review, because I can't see that any self-respecting institution will accept we're local and not global, that's for sure. So, where does that take you to? And in terms of the implications for research, it's like I know more about as a vice dean for research, not vice dean for education. I wear another hat in an organisation called Scopus. It sounds like a spy, but it's not a spy body. Scopus, together with Thomson Web of Science, are the two bodies that try and decide whether law journals, in fact all the journals in the world, are or not of quality. A tremendous responsibility. And we have a board meeting next week in San Francisco for all the different subjects, and I have to decide on all the law journals, all the languages in the world, whether they should be included or not. Be included as a sign of merit, because the subscribers who pay for having Scopus want to know that they're not wasting their time reading these things. Law journals are a particularly problematic form of journal, because the normal method of deciding whether a journal is good is the level of citations. The normal way that maybe you, in appointing people or promoting, think about citations. But here's this question of local and global. Somebody can be doing extremely good work or writing about something extremely important, but it just isn't going to get a larger echo. It's not the same thing that if you're researching on cancer, you must quote everybody else who's worked on that bit of what could be causing cancer and add your little bit to it. It doesn't work quite in the same way. So the local and global as an educational question is what sort of lawyers you're trying to produce, also affects who you're appointing, what you want them to do, particularly because up until now, correct me if I'm wrong, Israel has used the resonance of publications in the American market as one very important clue to whether you're doing the right thing. Stop.
Okay, so
Short response because we have
a very short response. The review did not say anything specifically about Haifa in this regard. The review said that it referred to all the law schools, I think, in this regard, saying that the emphasis on publication on American law reviews is problematic, and you should emphasize that. That was the main issue.
But that Haifa should focus locally. That's what
No, I don't think there was a specific point. Haifa should focus local, and others should focus international. I think the idea was. But anyway, of course, nobody even would suggest the idea here that we will only write in Hebrew for local journals. That's not the point. The question was more about the balance between the two that was questioned by the reviewers. And by the way, the university didn't accept that, and no other university that I know accepted that in Israel. So
the question is an open one. That's why I'm raising it again.
So at the end of the day, we're still measuring ourselves mainly by the reputation of the American law journals in which we publish. And
Us
not,
too.
Huh? Yeah. so that didn't really change because of the higher education review, and I won't answer the other question because
So please, and then Michael and Joe.
I think there's that there are a couple of things. Our model is very much like Penn's, but it is. There is an element that I think we need to get into the discussion, is that the model is itself very dynamic. So why did the LLM programs explode in the United States? Because they're subsidizing everything else. As Anita said, this is our terrific source of revenue. But they have now become a place where there's a lot of price discounting. So the published price, I think we're only at 60,000, but the published price is 60. That's not what we can charge anymore. The parties who have been driving that are the Chinese, because they have terrific information networks, and they negotiate with everybody. So I guess one of the things I wanted to get in here is that these are dynamic markets. You're having the worries about global and local. So is our Chief Justice having that worry. And he has commented that there is a wild imbalance in what law schools are doing. The same kind of discussion, I think, is going on. It's different starting points, but a lot of dynamism. There was one other thing. I just wanted to get in on the dynamism theme. It was mentioned, would we have a variety of things like clinics required? We self-consciously decided not to, so we did not spend inordinate amounts of time fighting with the 5% of the students who don't want to do it. What we have tried to do are create incentives And when we took out the requirement, we actually went from, I think it was around 80 to 88% of the students doing it. And we just decided the other 12, it's not worth the time to fight with them. But it was also, are we going to be teaching things like big data? I'm discovering I don't have any choice. The students already are doing it. And the shifts in their expectations, abilities, have shifted dramatically. I think it's in the last 7 years. I feel like I'm teaching different types of people. And so some of what I'm saying is these are actually, it's not we're on inflection points, which we are, but that the incentive structures in which our students are operating, in which the faculty are operating, in which we're operating in these international markets are causing us to respond all of the time. And our SJD, by the way, is free.
I should start with a couple of prefaces. When Corinne invited me, I had multiple communications over why. It's still an issue of struggling. A lot of you are engaged in things. But I want to preface a couple of things to add to the table in thinking about the why. So I've taught at Stanford for 50 years. Since 1967, with a number of times during that period on leave in government in a range of ways. At both the federal level, as the general counsel of a federal agency, and running a local agency, the Human Services Department in San Francisco, and a range of other things. For 50 years, I've been trying to figure out what I do in teaching, and I still haven't figured that out, what it is that I'm trying to produce, a source of tension and frustration for me over all of my life, given that I have tried to be outside of the thing and see how you actually act as a lawyer as well, and be a lawyer. And one of the things, I come with an interdisciplinary background, teach interdisciplinary and research kind of things. If I were to look for research on what kind of law teaching actually makes a difference in students' lives in better practice 10 years down the line, it would be a very short read. I wouldn't spend an afternoon reading the empirical research that we all believe ought to be tested, all of the government programs and everything, with empirical research as to outcomes of what it is. The likelihood that we ever test anywhere, whether now at Stanford, I was very involved in getting clinics started at Stanford, and now all of our students take clinics. Are they better lawyers because they take clinics? We don't know. Are they better lawyers because of all kinds of things? So I think we don't have an internal mechanism of answering a lot of these questions. And at one point or another, in the 50 years at Stanford, I've been involved in every one of the issues from in 1973 when we had our first African American students, should we have a special preparation program, or to all of these other kinds of things. The second part, I want to just say something that was only the one thing I was going to add, but it now relates to the Israel versus where you publish. Okay, I'm in the process. I've been heavily involved for the last 50 years with child abuse policy, child maltreatment policy in the United States. I drafted most of the federal laws. I was involved in a lot of the litigation. I ran an agency. I'm writing a book examining the 50 years. The sort of first paragraph is that 50 years ago, I became involved in the start of a new thing in the United States, a more public focus on child maltreatment. And I've been heavily involved in that for the last 50 years. In my first year, there were 60,000 reported cases of child maltreatment in the United States. And last year, there were 7 million. My career involved making a 100-fold increase in the problem I was working on. I don't actually believe I made a 100-fold thing.
Neither do we.
But the fact is, I drafted most of the legislation and was involved in litigation, the great bulk of which was not implemented. And when I talk with people in the environmental area, with a whole lot of other areas, the people that I deal with constantly, everything they work on works up here, but not in implementation. And why, and even if you look, I've been involved in a lot of test case litigation. Lawyers have concentrated on getting on the cause of action and winning a case, but the remedies section and how you actually change a foster care system through a court order, or how you change school systems. Of course, we've been trying to desegregate schools through litigation for more than 50 years, and we have more segregation now than we had. The move from a conceptual thing to implementation is really difficult. So after I've started, even though I'm emeritus, teaching a course called implementation, and how do you draft a statute or design a remedy in a case that makes it more likely to be implemented. It's very hard to get the students to understand implementation. You're not teaching case law. Why aren't you teaching cases? Everybody else is teaching cases. And I say, well, it's because the lawyers don't do cases. They do other things. A small percentage do cases in my area, but most do implementation. Yet all of the people who want to take my courses are practitioners, public interest lawyers in particular, because they all do these kinds of things. It's hard for me to conceive that we need more theory in US journals from Israeli lawyers. It just, we have too much theory from anybody in American journals on what things ought to be, and how to make that happen doesn't exist for a large part of the literature. And a lot of that is going to be site-specific around implementation. In the United States, of course, you've got 50 different states implementing things differently, and within states, thousands of counties doing it differently in different sort of ways. And this course has a lot of different areas. I would strongly, at least from my experience, for some portion of scholarship, think it has to be Israeli-based in context of how does law play out on the ground. It doesn't generally play out in theory. It plays out by actors taking what we do and trying to put them into lawyers' behavior in all kinds of ways and other things. We're far too court-focused and far too theory and would be my takeaway of 50 years of looking at all of this.
Okay, I've only been teaching for 20, so I don't have that much to say. 2 points I would make. One thing that happened in the U.S. is the end of state subsidies, which can, I'm not saying it would happen, but it can happen. So University of Minnesota, we used to be low tuition, low aid model, low salaries also altogether. And then, but now, basically, states have gotten out of the subsidy of law school business. They're out of subsidizing professional school. So we're like publicly branded, but we're not really publicly funded. So you have to start up the fundraising model. So one, obviously, vulnerability of, depending on the state subsidies, it doesn't last forever. The other thing I thought was interesting that I didn't hear you say is that a lot of what law schools do is driven by ranking. So this huge mistake law schools made is this third-rate newspaper, U.S. News and World Report, which really didn't have a constituency like Time and Newsweek decided we're going to do rankings. And in the beginning, it was like fun and games. People sent it in. Obviously, the people at the top love it. But what happened is whatever they rank is what law schools do. So why are LLMs cash cows? They don't count for ranking. So like most of the, like the sticker price is it's a terrible system in part because if you're not sophisticated, you think I have to pay all this money, you don't realize, but actually the JDs are very subsidized according to their likely success and their credentials and all that stuff. So you have to use LLMs as cash cows because they don't count in the rankings. If they all of a sudden their credentials somehow count in the rankings, totally different system. So one thing I didn't hear any of you talking about is like the rankings game between. I don't know if there is a rankings game in Israel, but at least in the U.S. that maybe it's too tense the subject, but I feel like Israelis talk about everything. But in the U.S. that's under everything. That's under everything, and that also is under the LLM program. The LLM program on one hand is globalization, but it's really how do you get students, just like we take transfers because they don't count for the rankings. Right. So LLM is a way to get students that don't count for the rankings, and the reason it's only recently to subsidize them is because initially it was just their source of money. But then everyone got into the LLM business because everyone figured out the same game, so now you have to compete, and LLMs aren't quite as lucrative as they
were. I would just say that despite the fact that we publish, well, first of all, we do publish in Hebrew. We don't have to. We have to publish in English. That's funny. And no deal will promote you unless at least half of what you publish is in English. But we do publish in Hebrew. And the second thing is, I think there is more space, and I can't really explain that in any incentive-oriented way for academics in both in the case law and in legislation. So Israeli scholars, legal scholars, affect both legislation and the case law. Of course, the Supreme Court of Israel is citing academic articles more than any other court in the world, I think. And it goes down to district court and magistrate courts that cite articles. Even in countries that Supreme Court cite articles, it rarely goes down to the lower courts, but here it does. And the Knesset listen to us. So how come we write theoretical? In some way, just the fact that someone published in I don't know, in Stanford Law Journal makes him more his reputation good enough for the Knesset or to the Supreme Court to hear him. I don't know if that's a good explanation. That's just a guess now.
Okay, so Carrie, Owen, is there anyone else?
Does anybody rank you, by the way?
There's no official ranking in Israel. No, or unofficial. There's no ranking. We all try to present other things that play in our favor. But
there was a review of the Higher Education Committee which specifically didn't rank.
It deliberately didn't rank.
But one point that should be mentioned here is that Hebrew in Bar Ilan offers their own ranking of law journals.
And now
are you doing it the same?
No, we're not.
So one interesting point about Hebrew University is that by definition, so they started with the A, B, C, and D, right? By definition, Israeli law journals started out with the B ranking, which offers a very acute signal to prospective, faculty members, those facing tenure track.
And to put things in perspective, it actually increased by putting it in B, we actually increase the incentives of people to publish in Israel.
Second category.
Because everybody knew that on the market terms it was less than that.
But for you it's A.
For you, it's the second. It's the second category. They start with A. We start with A plus.
They're shaking their heads down there. What does that mean?
There's a difference between,
let me-
determining something
let me-
as A or as B.
I was next, right? A moment of a little defense of Israeli legal education from an outsider, okay? So I was the founder of the Penn Clinic. I don't know if Anita knows that or not.
I do know
Yeah.
that.
And as you'll hear later, I believe in policy labs and social problem solving. You'll hear about that later. Stanford does it. I've been doing it all my life. When I taught here, I just want for the Americans to hear this and for you Israelis to not get so defensive about stuff. When I taught here 11 years ago, 2007, and I was teaching that courts are not the answer and that we should be learning other skills, mediation, negotiation, conflict resolution. I teach that subject all over the world, and I do a series of brain teaser exercises to test the creativity of students as legal problem solvers. So some of it's legal and some of it's completely outside of law. It's a great joy for me to say this out loud because I've never put it in an article. When I teach here, and I do these problem solving, well, if you all want to do it over lunch, I'll show you some of these brain teasers. I have never taught anywhere where everybody in the class got most of them. Why? IDF. They had done a lot of problem solving in their Army training. And so there was a kind of interesting ability to think your way out of difficult situations that comes from military training. I asked the students, why is this going on? They're very different. Some of them are verbal, some of them are conceptual, some of them are spatial. And so everybody here knows, as you just heard, Israeli legal education is a first degree, but there's also people that have had a whole bunch of training in other places. So I go to a place like Japan, in contrast, right, where people have gone to lots and lots of school before I teach, and they can't answer any of these. I mean, that's a slight overstatement. I realized for 30 years I should have been keeping track of this because I would have a really interesting empirical base to show you all kinds of horrible generalizations about countries. Which ones can solve these problems and which ones can't. In South America, the only people that solve them have been my translators. When I used to teach Spanish very badly, now I teach in English, and the people in the translation boxes get them when the students can't. Why? Because they're used to thinking in different modes. So there are many ways of getting into disciplinary education. So the problem, in my view, and this is true in England and other places where law is a first degree, is that students don't have enough other education, and so law, doctrinal thinking becomes the way they think. In the United States, one good thing you can say about it, I have a lot of bad things to say, is that everybody has a degree in something else before they get there. Nevertheless, my American students are about less than 50-50 these days in solving these problems. That's a whole other issue because they're so busy doing game playing on video games and online that teaches another kind of thinking that they're actually becoming less resilient in solving some of these other problems. So my experience here, you know, it's a few years old now, is that that there are other competencies that people have, and that I'm not advising everybody, you know, in our countries go into the Army. I'm a pacifist, you all know that, or many of you know that. But there are other ways of getting knowledge, and I was very impressed at Haifa with in my case, not as diverse a class because it was in English, but still with a number of Arab and Israeli and Jewish Israeli students. The ability to sort of think in other different ways was very important. So, I'll say more later. I just think there are different ways of doing interdisciplinarity. Now, quickly, on the scholarship stuff, I am an outside evaluator for tenure in most of the Israeli universities. I've done Bar Ilan and Haifa and Hebrew, and I spent a lot of time in those letters telling people to stop paying attention to this stupid listing of journals because it depends on your field. And you'll appreciate this, Karen. When I began writing feminist stuff, none of the women's journals were originally listed in the American Journal lists. I mean, never mind the list of quality. They weren't in the first move from books to searchable services online. You couldn't find the Harvard Women's Law Journal where I published. You couldn't find the Berkeley Women's. I mean, it was ridiculous. So when people were looking at publication and citation rates, there were gender differences, and then never mind when all the, both the international journals and the race journal, any journal that wasn't a core journal of one of the major schools initially didn't even get put in there. So I, as an outsider, what I offer is the help to everybody to stop the rankings of any kind, both law schools, but also these journal rankings, because when I'm writing letters on behalf of Israeli scholars, it depends on your field. This becomes a big issue even in England, where there are academic rankings of the socio-legal journals that I am familiar with. I used to edit one of them, International Journal of Law and Context, and people want to know, well, how does this, the journal doesn't rank. These days with SSRN, we read articles based on what the article's about. I almost never look at where anything's published anymore because I'm reading stuff on SSRN right away as it comes out. I will look at the topic, I look at the author. That's a form of, elitism also. Why should I be looking at someone I already know has written good articles as opposed to looking at junior people? But that's another, I just want to make technological disruption. SSRN, where stuff gets put up before it's published, is where most people are doing their reading, at least, in the worlds that I live in, not in where things get published. And everyone in this room knows the decisions for who gets published in those fancy American law journals are made by students. It's ridiculous. In no serious academic field would students be deciding. So those of you trying to get tenure in Israel on the basis of some students who are reading, it's totally absurd. So defense on behalf of students in Israel, who I just thought were fabulous, and those of you doing an academic evaluation, that's something as an outsider I would say needs to be thought about. End of that speech. I got more.
Very painful topic here.
I know.
Tony, I apologize. This is all very interesting. I need to go.
Oren, Isi, we have time for really closing remarks, so if anybody else wants, please hold up your hand.
Okay, so two quick comments. One about the fees, the LLM fees in the US. I think there are options in Europe that people should think about. And when I did my LLM and PhD, I went to London School of Economics, which was cheaper and I think as good, and you get a lot of scholarships because Israel is part of the membership of the is an associate country of the EU. You get options. So this is, I think, an option for Israeli students. And a quick comment about publication. So our ranking of journals first give legitimacy to Israeli scholars to publish in Hebrew. We think it's ridiculous just to require them to abandon publishing in Hebrew and do everything in English, although it is still very important to be able to publish outside. And the other thing that we did is we create a complete equality between peer-reviewed journals and student-edited journals. There are very good peer-reviewed journals, which some of them are much more globalized in their thinking. And so we sent a clear message to our faculties that they can get promotion, etc., even if they published through all their career in peer-review journals. And I wouldn't say, anything about, the absurd process of publication in the U.S. System, which you're all familiar with. So this is something that we've done at my faculty.
So, I for one does not think it's absurd at all. Having published both in peer reviews and student-run reviews, I actually find student-run reviews to be better than the peer review that I've worked with. A lot of time, they're very smart students. They're being helped by faculty. And I found my articles, and I've been, I published in quite a few. I found that they managed to actually make them much better after. So they make mistakes, and you have to explain some of the things to them. But I think they do a very good job, and their errors. Okay, they make mistakes, both negative ones and positive ones. They don't take all the good articles, but I think on average, they're doing a pretty good job. In terms of Hebrew publication, so I publish a lot in Hebrew, but the competition is much harder when you're talking about publishing in the U.S. So I think there is a merit to that too. I think if we all got promoted only by publication in Hebrew, and again, 50% of my publications are in Hebrew, and this is because I want to influence the Israeli legal arena. It's important for me, personally. But I do think it's important that we have a market that is more competitive in terms of it's much easier to publish articles. I can publish any of my articles in Mishpatim and Yonei Mishpat, and a top tier university, and the rest of you too. It's not that big a deal. So it is important. And the third thing, this is something that Shai Blank, I was talking to Willie Shai Blank, my friend and colleague, and he was asking himself, like, how come in the US the first year professors are also excellent teachers and they actually invest a lot into teaching? And I think one of the things that he came up with, that they respect them much more than we do, in a way, respect their students, and see them in a way as future colleagues, because they know that these people are going to be, fulfill all the important positions, in Harvard, like Yale students, Stanford students. They'll be the judges, they'll be professors, they will be top lawyers, and they treat them in this way, from the get-go. And in a way, I think we should also adopt a different kind of attitude, I would say, toward our students. That's my 2 cents.
I think this is a great place to stop in adopting a new attitude for our students. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
And thank you for Tami for moderating the panel so skillfully, and no less important, with a very refined British accent. We'll all be envious of. So thank you so much. And now we are going to taste some delicious Israeli food. And we will be back at around 2.
Wait, I think we're going back to the other room, right? Huh? Not okay.
No, we will keep you posted.
So we'll keep you posted during lunch where we're going to be because of air conditioning.
So we might be taking the meeting to the back to the hotel?
No, not to the hotel, to another room at the university.
One of the things, on that, how rapidly things are changing. I taught sports and law 7 years ago. I'd have one girl in it, maybe 2, maybe one foreign student, up to 30% foreign students, and JV. 40% women, and something is going on that they don't feel intimidated.
That's good.
No, but I think sometimes we spend way too much time worrying about we've got to protect